Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. When I say welcome back here, for us, it's just been a few moments since we last recorded the episode of The Room Where It Happened that you listened to. But for you, it may have been a couple of days or who knows how much longer. But I have the same cast of characters. We had someone join us during The Room Where It Happened, room number 8, and that was Robert. So Robert, I'm going to say hi to you first because we didn't get to acknowledge you on the other episode for The Room. But good to have you here for this particular episode of AFIT.
Thank you, Don. Great to be here with everybody.
And the rest of the normal crew, we are really missing, and I mean really missing. I just want to shout out to him now. He's in an airport or a plane somewhere. Eric Rush could not be part of our recording tonight, and it's got to be killing Eric. So we will give him a lot more latitude and a lot more room in subsequent episodes because he will need to be making up for lost time. But I do have Alexis, Chris, and Eric Bond. Part of our dueling two-headed Erics here. So we've got Eric covered. We just don't have both of our Erics here. And of course, we're joined by Dr. Bo Breslin, who tells us it's okay to call him Bo. So we're being informal because he said that is okay. And as we mentioned on The Room Where It Happened, the concept came from Bo reaching out, but also because of the book that he's written. Bo, if you could just give us the quick 30-second to 1 minute thumbnail for those that may not have heard the other episode about what your book is about in the area of the idea of a generational constitution, a constitution for the living.
Yeah. So thanks, Don. And thanks again for having me on the podcast. The book takes a simple premise that Jefferson thought that constitutions ought to be written every generation, and that it was kind of tyrannical to have a constitution govern a current people, a constitution written by a past generation govern current people. And he argued that the earth belongs to the living, his very famous phrase. And so that each generation ought to write its own constitution. For him, that meant every 19 years. My book is a simple counterfactual, right? What would those constitutions have looked like if Jefferson had won that debate? And I just have 5 constitutions: 1825, 1863, 1903, 1953, and 2022. And I just imagine us living in a Jeffersonian world in which generations write new constitutions more frequently than we currently have.
And that exists because that was part of what was agreed in the 1787. This is what we are going to do. So it's not a question of are we going to do it, although that is an interesting premise for the 1863, given what's going on, is are we really going to do this? And we'll get there in a future episode. But the idea that this is how the American constitutional democratic republic, this is how it works. This is what was there from the founding document that we already agreed upon. This is how we're going forward. Where this will act a lot like A Fork in Time, which is why I think it's a great thing, and I'm glad Bill reached out to us. It's what we do all the time. Imagine these counterfactuals, these what ifs, and Bo's done that here in his book. What's going to be a little bit different here is we're going to have, to the extent that he's participating, I'm going to ask Bo to set up the things that are there, sort of set up what's different again, because the what if here is not going to be the thing of the idea of one event changes. It's going to be the what if is that we actually are having this thing, and what does that mean? So it's going to be a little bit different there. So when you were thinking about the 1825 convention for the book, Bill, when I mentioned this on The Room Where It Happened, one of the things I love about the book is how you bring the perspective of the players or a personality, or told from almost the point of view of that person and how they're engaging things. What was running through your head as you drew up on 1825, realizing that was how the math was going to guide things for you?
Well, the first and most obvious one, Don, is the 1824 election, right? So the presidential election, John Quincy Adams emerges as the president, despite the fact that he doesn't get the largest sum of electoral votes. And so that was obvious. For the listeners out there, what I was looking for in crafting these constitutional conventions, and ultimately the constitutions that came out of them, what's happening at the time, right? And the most obvious thing is the election. But there are other things that are happening at the time. A fair number of delegates to a constitutional convention were Jacksonian fans. They probably would have been pissed off at John Marshall's Supreme Court power. And so that's happening at the time. And so, Don, when I'm thinking about the 1825 Constitution, I'm thinking about what's happening at the time. Are there court decisions? Are there amendments that are being made? And then crafting a convention around those important historical moments.
Okay. So this was the first time in your thought exercise that we've been invited to be a part of here and now to discuss. Yeah. This was the first time that was there. And we talked about this, I think, to a degree in the room where it happened, and even some of our off podcast, figuring out who gets to come was a part of this, right? I mean, that was one of the first things you also had to address, right? Figuring out how the players get assembled before you figure out what they're going to do when they show up on the field is who gets invited and how they get there, right?
Correct. And for the 1825 convention, unlike some of my later conventions, it's easier. I'll say it's easier. There's no question in my mind that women would not have been invited to the 1825 convention. There's no question in my mind that people of color would not have been invited to the 1825 Constitutional Convention. The country just wasn't there yet, right? So now you're limited, Don, to a certain group of folks. And the major players at the time would have been the Daniel Websters of the world, right? The Martin Van Burens of the world, those the Andrew Jacksons, the Henry Clays of the world, the John Calhouns of the world. These people would have been invited to the 1825 convention because they represented their states, their territories, their regions powerfully, and they would have been picked by state legislatures, which is the way I used in 1825, the selection process. So those were relatively easy. It gets more complicated in the later conventions.
Was there anybody, when you were thinking about this, you mentioned Daniel Webster, he plays an important role in that chapter in the book as being representative of that age and the ilk of person that would be there. Was there anybody that in your mind challenged Webster for being in that role, or was immediately, do you think it's got to be Daniel Webster, right?
Well, because of his oratorical skill, right? He was so widely respected. And it sets up nicely for me because, of course, at the time he crafted the law in such a way because he was such an effective attorney, right? He was such an effective lawyer, and he represents some of the great. He represents the victors in some of the great Supreme Court decisions of all times. So Webster has a certain cachet that nobody else has in terms of constitution making. Sure, there are some great politicians there, but nobody has the same cachet as Daniel Webster. He's sort of, in my mind, the Madison of the 1825 Constitutional Convention. That said, he's a Federalist, and he loses a lot of the debates he wants to. But there's no question he would have been there, and he would have been arguably the most important voice of the time.
Okay. So in your version of the Cliff Notes version, which nobody should ever use those, no respectable professor wants that to be what's happening, obviously, right. Is what are the major things that come out of your 1825 convention? And that's what I'd like to have the panel here sort of chase down is, okay, once you get that, how does that, what we do all the time on A Fork in Time, how does that influence, the subsequent years that we see? We talked about this actually right before we started recording, sort of setting our ground rules, our convention for how this was going to work, because what you do in the book is you build successively upon those things. We'll take a slightly different approach in that we do the speculative history thing, so we can say, okay, you change that. What does that now mean in terms of impact? It's the application. So what were the big things in your 1825 that came out that, what's new and different in the new and improved Constitution?
So this is going to, so the obvious one is Electoral College reform, because two times in the first several presidential elections, we had sort of this botched election, right? Where where it gets thrown into the House of Representatives. That's not what the original framers intended. So electoral college reform, how do we figure out, this is what in 1825, they would have been frustrated with the 1824 election. How do we figure out how to avoid that problem again? There would be, in my mind, no question, some sort of reform of the selection process for federal court judges. No question about it. In part because lots of states, Don, had gone down the route of changing the way in which they select their high court judges. So if you think about, and one of the data that I'm using here is state constitutional conventions often. If you think about the ways in which they crafted differences in things like the selection process of federal court judges, those would have trickled up, right? Those would have bubbled up to the Philadelphia Convention in 1825. And people were sufficiently pissed off at John Marshall that they would have thought of a way to figure out how to hold federal court judges accountable. The most obvious example of the most common example at the state level in that way was having the probationary period. It's typically a 7-year probationary period at the state level. And then after the probationary period, you have life tenure after that. I think that probably would have bubbled up to the federal convention. The one that's my all-time favorite is in terms of the 1825 Constitution, is the change to the preamble, right? So our preamble ends with a promise to our posterity, right? The future generations. If you live in a Jeffersonian world, our posterity is not necessary because the next generation is actually going to write its own constitution. So they go, in my imaginary constitutional convention, they go and scratch the promise to our posterity at the end of the preamble, which I always found to be fascinating.
Pregnant pause. Don trying to not talk as much on this episode as he did on the last one. So anybody jump in that has something.
Rock in my head now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll tell the story. The reason why I have Schoolhouse Rock in my head, it's a very dumb reason. But when I was in college, one of the classes I took for my degree, which was journalism mass comm, was media law.
Yeah.
And the very first day of class, my professor, who also happened to be my advisor, she said, I will give anybody 10 points on their final grade if they can recite the preamble to the Constitution. And I did it immediately. I raised my hand and I said, I can do it right now.
Thank you, ABC Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock, exactly.
Which her parents imposed upon her. So,
and I have them on DVD, so I will impose them on my future children. Yeah. But after I did it,
imagine a DVD player when that comes around. I just saying, digitize those right
digitize now.
Okay.
Digitize too. It's fine. YouTube exists too. They're there too. Yeah. But after I did it, because of course I didn't sing it, I just recited it. But everybody in the class was like, how did you do that? So I immediately took out my phone and I played the video of Schoolhouse Rock. So I just, in my head, I immediately went, well, that just ruined Schoolhouse Rock for me because, sorry, dumb thing, but. You know,
and this is how Bo has now messed up everything, because now you would actually have to put into your YouTube search, original preamble, 1825 preamble. You'd have to actually specify which one it is in order to get there. I was struck by that too, Bo, when I read the thinking of, because we rely upon that posterity thing a lot in the way we think about the Constitution today. It's a living document designed for the posterity. But to your point, it's moot because we're going to come back around to do this in 19 years or whatever number of years. When you thought about that, when you just mentioned that now, do you think over time, and I think I saw this a little bit as I read through the book, the concept of each of these constitutional conventions, yes, it's important. It's a watershed moment of this generation, but this idea of, if we mess it up, somebody else will come along and fix it, right? Kind of thing. Or do you think it would carry the same weight all the way through by the time you get to the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th 20th iteration. I mean, is there something about that absence of posterity that we talked about this, I guess, in the Room Where It Happened episode as well, about how you think about the founders if you have a new generation of quote unquote revisers every time you come around to it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question too, Don. I'd say the answer to that question is, I think over time it would become routine, right? The notion of constitutional reform, constitutional change would become routine. And what is most fascinating in all of this is, what's the role of amendments between the conventions? So, in 1820,
do you wait? Hey, we're doing it in 10 years. We just wait. Yeah,
exactly. In 1825, they're guessing that, okay, the next one's going to be roughly 1863. Is there something that happens in 1840 that you've got to resolve quickly, or do you sit there and wait? I draft some or craft some stories in which they waited. Because you want to, in a convention, you want to think holistically, right? It's hard to do piecemeal amending in order to fix a problem, recognizing it may create a problem down the road. So I think there would be a routinization of the convention making process. I think the founders in 1825 would have not had the cachet that the 1787 founders had, simply because it was the second one. It was, kind of happening. But I also think the amendment process would be very different. And one of the things that's tragic is we've only had 27 amendments, 10 of which happened in the first couple of years. So the amendment process, I think, has been a real disaster for the Constitutional Convention. And I think they would have changed that pretty quickly early on.
To make it easier or more frequent in some way?
Yeah. The number of, if you think about our only models, our only examples of constitutional conventions and amendments outside of the federal one is states. There have been 155-ish state constitutional conventions since 1787. Some have had a lot, right? Louisiana's had 10 or 12. Some have only had one, but there have been 155. There have been close to 10,000 amendments proposed over the course of, and hundreds that have been passed in these state constitutions, mostly because the bar for amending a state constitution is not as high as the federal constitution is. And so I think they would have lowered the bar because amendments would have taken on a different role in a Jeffersonian world.
I was going to comment that our home state, mine and Don's home state of Texas, probably contributed about half of those 10,000.
Right. Right.
It seems like every election we're doing at least 10.
Well, and of course, the long-standing thought in Texas is no man's property or liberty is safe as long as the legislature is in session. So let's make sure we limit that to as much as possible.
And then what's the role of referenda, right? At some point, not in 1825, but what's the role of referenda to change constitutions at the federal level? It's obviously never happened because we have a very structural piece, but at some point, if you lower the barrier and you throw a referenda in, it becomes a very different type of document.
Looking at you, our native Californian.
Hello.
So I have a question. You mentioned there's going to be a change. Let's start getting into the nitty gritty of what's going to happen here. So we change the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Do we go to popular vote? What does that change? No.
So in 1825, they would not have thought popular vote would have been they're still thinking, Chris, mostly about sort of this elitist propertied male voter. And so they're not yet there. What I argue is, there's this Jacksonian populism happening at the same time. This notion that, he's sort of the Federalist idea has faded, and the Jeffersonian Republican ideas have kind of taken over, and Jackson is their leader. They would have likely wanted to strip a lot of the power from state legislatures in terms of selecting electors, right? And so make it more popular, but still keeping electors in place. That, I think, is the iteration in 1825. I think by the 21st century, the Electoral College goes away, but not in 1825 or 1863, 1903 or 1953. Definitely by our current situation, I think the Electoral College completely goes away, modified in 1825.
So in 1825, do they basically change the, if you win a state, you get all of it rule, that the electors are getting split up among the states? Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of sets more of a populist opinion about it without at the same time going to a popular vote.
Robert, I don't think that there's any chance that they would have thought about eliminating the unit rule at that time. I do think that the unit rule ends up being eliminated, but not in 1825. And I think it is eliminated, and what is introduced is a congressional district rule of one electoral vote per congressional district, and then the winner of the state gets the 2 Senate votes.
So we're all Nebraska all of a sudden, or something like that, right?
Yeah, Nebraska or Maine, but not in 1825. Remember, the other thing to think about, which is super fun to think about, is constitutional framers, no matter when they are in history, are a conservative lot. And by conservative, I mean small c conservative, right? Most of them, depending on how many you have in the room, getting back to Don's question, like who's in the room, most people will gravitate to the middle. So the idea that there would be radical, issues, concepts, and ideas that come out of a constitutional convention in 1825 is probably off the mark. I would have lost some credibility if I came up with an idea from the 21st century and imposed it on 1825. So I don't think there's reform to the Electoral College, but not the elimination of the Electoral College. There is reform to the judicial selection, but not the elimination of life tenure and fixed salaries once you get past the probationary period. These are a conservative group of people who will gravitate towards the middle, I think, in any constitutional convention, especially if you start to get a lot of folks in the room, like you have to in the 20th and 21st century. In 1825, lots of new states have been added. So you need to add more than the 55 delegates, but it's probably somewhere around 100, 110, something like that in 1825. There's still going to be a conservative lot.
So go ahead, Derek. Go ahead.
Now, I had a very fun idea from the most bitter man in politics at that time, John C. Calhoun.
Mm-hmm.
I always just think of just like, man, he is always the also-ran of just everything.
Yes.
And I think John C. Calhoun would probably propose that no state can secede from the Union as a way to knock Daniel Webster and everybody from New England for the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812. Of like, no, if we get to do something, you guys don't get to complain and leave. And I, John C. Calhoun, will never regret that phrase.
So that's the thing that is always interesting to me. It cuts both ways. In thinking about the group coming in that is so opposed to the Electoral College, the Jacksonian Democrats here, the Electoral College actually probably benefits them in that it accounts for the 3/5 rule still, where South Carolina, Tennessee, the South, gets a magic number added to their vote total that they don't get if you go based upon the number of citizens or people you allow to vote.
Definitely. No question about it. And, I mean, if not for the corrupt bargain, right? So Henry Clay decides he's willing to give up his electoral votes to John Quincy Adams in order to become Secretary of State. If not for the corrupt bargain, Jackson wins that election. So Jackson, who does not know what his future holds, this is the great fork in time, right? He wants to be president, doesn't know what the future holds, has to advocate for electoral college reform because he cannot afford the House of Representatives again deciding the next election. So, Chris, despite some of the things that you're saying, I think Jackson has to advocate for the electoral college reform.
Oh, but like you said though, reform, but keep it in place because
of course.
the counting rules benefit him that way.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think that's why, to Bo's point, the small c conservative, another way to think of them is, for the most part, there's going to be an effort to preserve the status quo unless the status quo is non-defendable. That's why this is a slow process. It's incremental changes that happen, even though these conventions are spaced over time. Is that there's always that tendency of the devil that I know versus the devil that I don't kind of thing that's there. And as you point out, those that are influence authority are able to be there. Aside from what we talked about, getting your constitutional convention summoned, so you just end up with a random sampling of America, which would be a fascinating thing. I don't know what would come out of that, but it'd be a fascinating thing to watch. I would sell tickets. I'd buy tickets to go and see that event. I think you make an important point there, Bo, about the nature of, even when there's change, the change is conservative, small c, in its ilk and its design, just because it's preserving what we know and creating. The other C is continuity that goes with that moves forward with it. But also what struck me about the two first things that, the two things we've talked about there, you're dealing with obvious defects, or what are recognized as being obvious defects in the document that need to be corrected. And in both cases, they are responses to things.
Correct.
This process for electing the president hasn't worked. We didn't think through, the runner-up, who maybe, his biggest enemy is now the guy that's one heartbeat away. Is that really where we want this to be? And then the other part being the idea of, I don't think any of the original founding fathers, in my mind, imagined the judiciary in the role that judiciary had very quickly assumed. You have, Marbury versus Madison, you have those very powerful early precedent setting, where the Supreme Court says there's a vacuum, we're filling it, and this is how we're doing it and how this is written. So that the judiciary part you talk about there is also responsive from both spectrums. We don't want activist judges in either direction. We want more of the status quo to be maintained.
The a couple of quick things, John, in response to you. Absolutely true about the judiciary, right? So you've got the Marbury versus Madison, you got the McCulloch versus Maryland's. Those who believed that states were more powerful than the federal government were absolutely irate at Marshall's decisions, one after the other, right? The reality was, if there is a period from 1787 to the start of the Civil War, the court primarily is angling for two things, right, under Marshall's watch. One is when there's a disagreement between the federal government and the states, 95% of the time, Marshall's supporting the federal government's power. And then when he's also simultaneously trying to establish the judiciary as a co-equal branch, right? So in 1825, they would have reacted to that. The other thing I'll say, Don, one more thing in response to I get this a lot when I have conversations like this. Would anybody have come to a constitutional convention with the Madisonian idea of scrapping completely the Constitution before and starting over from scratch? And the answer is no, right? In my opinion, because, and our evidence is, what state has a parliamentary system? None, right? So there are certain structural pieces that would have continued because most framers, regardless of when they are in time, are that small c conservative who want the small c continuity and will maintain the devil that they know. Sorry, Robert, I was interrupting.
No, you're perfectly fine. My thought is that this convention has the least chance of having anything major happen at it, because first of all, the living memory of the founders is still in that room. Matter of fact, right. Jefferson is the president of the convention.
Yeah, he's still there, right?
Yeah, he is sitting there.
Right. Madison decides not to show because he's sick and so on. Yeah.
And so I think this is the convention where you're going to see the least amount of change. I'm thinking you're right. They go and they fix the structural things.
Right.
The election thing. Let's think through that a little bit. And so they do that. I'm more intrigued, and maybe we talk about this and explore it. I think the bigger exploration here is the federal judge changes.
Yeah.
What changes with that? How does, for instance, Dred Scott come into play?
And more so, just to pinpoint it, at that 10-year review of a judge, is this is this seen as a bit of a rubber stamp? As you haven't done anything almost impeachable, so we're going to continue on the bench? Or is this thanks for your service? Yeah, I'm looking a little bit further ahead to kind of a 1937 period, and trust me, there's a lot between now and then. But the Supreme Court holding back a lot of those New Deal changes, and if they're up for review in a way that they're not in our timeline specifically. So the question now is, what is that 10-year? What does that 10-year review look like? Is this one of those unspoken rules, kind of those gentlemanly agreements that we generally leave you there if you haven't done anything offensive, which can definitely be broken in certain time periods when norms like that are broken?
Right.
Or is the norm established that it's a revolving door, 10 years and you're almost out?
Yeah. So I think Robert's right with the fundamental premise, and that is it's unlikely that there would be huge dramatic changes this close to 1787, because some of these characters are still around. So, Chris, to answer the question and tie it back to what Robert said is, I think for the most part, the probationary period would have likely been closer to a rubber stamp than a genuine kind of interrogation of a judge's past, right? So I'm guessing 95% of them would have gone through and would have gotten their life tenure after their probationary period. That's the way it was at the state level.
That's informed by what you've often looked to here was what was going on inside the states, right?
Yeah. So and I mean, at the end of the day, what is so fascinating about the times then as opposed to the times now, and it's a little different in 1825 than it is in 1787, but in 1787 and in 1825, there are only a small number of players who really are at the top of their game, right? Unlike now, where the influences are coming from all angles on, whether they're interest groups or politicians or so on. Everybody knew each other back then, right? Jefferson and Marshall are distant cousins, right? So everybody knew each other. And so it would be hard to imagine with the kind of res publica, this notion of civic virtue and so on, that still is sort of in 1825, that you would boot your distant cousin or your friend after the probationary period. So I'm guessing that, Robert, the probationary period would have been meaningful, but probably not as meaningful as it comes later on in 1863 and 1903 and so on.
Well, my question is, does it change from the period of 1846 to 1960 or 1860?
Yeah.
That because you get where I'm going with
does
that.
It change structurally,
sure,
or does it change norm-wise?
Yeah, and I think
the
norm-wise is more the question there, because I'm thinking that if you're going to have a potential fork that has serious consequences, that's where a fork could hit. I think.
I think even a little bit before that, though, because the thing that I thought about was talk about Jackson again. Suddenly when you have this scenario of it's not life tenure appointments with approval, and you bring along the spoils system. So suddenly there's a new concept in terms of what's going on there. Does that infect the judiciary because there's been a change to the structure? And I'm sorry for cutting you off, though.
Yeah, no. I think you didn't cut me off. I think you're exactly right. I think when Roger Taney comes on the court, that's in some ways that's a game changer. And so I think things do start to dramatically change after 1840, let's say, right? 1830, 35 when Taney comes on. But ultimately, I think by 1863, there's real legitimacy and real credibility to the notion that the probationary period means something. Not in 1825, though.
I just find it very funny that the person who everybody would probably be afraid of, if he would even be invited to this, Jackson, right, is also going to be the person who probably diminishes the court the most during his presidency, mostly in the standoffs over the forced relocation of the Cherokee case.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right, Eric.
Yeah. So just how much that was in the room of just well, we're mad about the courts and we think the courts are going to be too powerful. Meanwhile, in our own timeline, one of the most famous things is the courts made their ruling. Now let's see them enforce it.
Right.
Which again, we tend to avoid politics for the reasons that we do here. That hasn't changed in many ways, even moving forward. Ultimately, you need an executive to enforce either legislative action or judicial action in this, this balance of power scenario. We different branches that aren't in and of themselves. I mean, that's also where things have blurred in bringing things really modern is the extent with the executive dabbles in things that were reserved originally for the legislature, and the things that the legislature dabbles in that were obviously originally reserved for the executive branch, the judicial branch. It's gotten a lot blurrier, I think, since 1787 and since 1825. Things have gotten a little. The three branches aren't as nice and finite as they used to be.
No, that's absolutely true. And at some point, you guys should do a Fork in Time podcast on what happens if Marshall rules against Jefferson in Marbury versus Madison. Jefferson ignores the ruling. And where does the court go from that, right? So one of the brilliance of Marshall, of course, you guys know, is that he threads that needle, right? He's able to take Jefferson behind the woodshed and slap him around a little bit and say, you're a bad person, but he still gives him the victory in Marbury versus Madison. What happens if he rules against Jefferson? The courts would be very different now if Marbury versus Madison hadn't been decided the way it was.
If I may ask just everybody here, do you think they would try to kind of fix the rules for the next generational constitution to where they say, okay, it needs to be conducted in such and such a way, to where they would write that in? Kind of like how we see the rules with the Pope, when that switches over, technically the previous pope can say anything they want for how the next one is determined, but until we get a chess match for the papacy, it's been kind of the same. Do we think this generation, to where they're considering the idea of like, oh, we might not be alive in 19 years to really like put our hand on the till here, should we try to put some rules that go against that Jeffersonian idea of like, well, maybe we keep 5 or 10 things that absolutely cannot be changed, or we strongly imply that they shouldn't?
Such a good question. And everybody on this panel has a particular view, and they're probably different than mine, but I'll throw Eric out, mine out. I think the answer to the question, from my perspective, is depends on the respect that people have for constitutions as different than legislation. So if you have, and I think in 1825, enough of those framers would have had significant respect for the constitutional text as the ultimate law. I don't think they would have, massaged it in such a way that it limits what folks can do in the next constitutional convention. Do I think that now? Yes. I do think today, if you had a constitutional convention, there would be attempts to limit. The other thing that's interesting is if you follow my storyline, right, that is, each generation is characterized by the next generation comes based on the average life expectancy of an American citizen. There's no guarantee we'll even have a country to constitute in the 22nd century when the next constitution comes around, right? If global warming works the way it's working, we may not have a country anymore, or it might be a constitution that is multiple countries, like an international constitutional document. So the interesting thing is, in 1825, they weren't thinking like that. But as we develop this evolutionary historical speculative history, things change so dramatically that, Eric, I think you're right. They put certain things in that limit what the next generation can do. I also think they think about this kind of transnational constitutional idea. Whether there's a constitution to a country to constitute in the future is another question. All of these are fascinating.
This goes far afield of us sticking on 1825, but I'm going to use founder's prerogative here and go there, because what you did, this was one of the things I guess that was in my head, but I hadn't quite articulated it in my own head until you were just talking there, is that not a lot things have changed from 1787 to 1825. Mm-hmm. Technology is evolving. Mm-hmm. Other things are evolving. Philosophies evolving, thoughts evolving. The nation is evolving in terms of the westward expansion. The idea of manifest destiny is really starting to gain a footing, and it's going to predominate for another 50 or plus years. Back to Eric's point about the relocation of the people that were already there, because we got to get them moved so that we can go there. But the irony, I think, comes around as you talk about the longer life expectancies, by the way, as a result of technology.
Right.
So suddenly you have the counter back to that is, can we afford to go more than 5 to 10 years without doing this? Because so much is changing so quickly that you have to be, to me, one of the brilliances of the 1787 document is how we've, without formally amended it, how we've adapted it, by the way, through the courts doing that and interpreting what it means. Right. But, I guess my broader question here, and I know this goes afield from the 1825, but I think we'll come back to it in the others, is, would there come a point where somebody comes along that's a counter Jefferson that says it's not just once a generation, you've got to do this once every little bit of progress, and the progress is happening so fast, we almost have to have a continuous at some point constitutional convention. Would there be the pushback? Obviously not in 1825 to 1863, but do we reach that point?
William Henry Harrison. It's William Henry Harrison. His inaugural speech was about how much he hated the Constitution, but he was going to play fair. And then he started a constitutional crisis in almost a very petty way by dying of sepsis. But it's William Henry Harrison, definitely. I'm putting all my money on it.
And by the way, we have an episode about that, so that Eric was a part of. So.
But if I'm going to get back to this idea of, do we kind of put things off limits? I think one of the interesting things about the American legal system, thank you, Alexis, is we so much base off of the old Brit. It's a unique blending of the of the English system of norm-based and this idea of we're going to write down some rules. And you talk about this in the book, that there's a certain amount of flexibility depending upon how it's written.
Yep.
And the American Constitution can survive because of the joining of that norm-based and that written system. And I think we don't ring fence certain things as long as, like I was saying earlier, those norms are respected.
Yes.
Once you start seeing understood norms go out the window, thinking about your 1953 Constitution, first thing you talk about there is presidential term limit. Because that norm went out the window, now we need to make a rule about it.
That's right. Right. So combining all of these threads, right? So the way constitutions are written, Don said this earlier on, the way constitutions are written are always a reaction to moments in which there was urgency, Chris, just like you said, right? So something unusual, something dramatic, something catastrophic happens, we need to change the Constitution in order to reflect that. Don, going back to you, because of technology and so on, those sorts of reactionary, dramatic moments are more frequent now than they were back in 1825. So yes, I think Don is right that in the anti-Jeffersonian world, you need to step up the number of constitutional conventions as opposed to once every 19 years or once every quote unquote generation. So those threads are combined. And yes, Eric, William Henry Harrison, we'll just leave it at that.
Just thinking about the time spans we've talked about, just putting this out there, what demographically in the United States, the baby boom was a huge issue. And yet, looking at the conventions we laid out, at one, they're elementary school, if not toddlers.
Yeah.
And at the other, they're senior citizens.
They're card carrying art. They're card carrying art. They're either in preschool or they're card carrying art members.
Right.
And there's nothing when they're in the middle of their prime working life that's there. Which to me, that one of the things I really appreciate about the concept, though, and we talk about it, and again, we'll get back to the 1825 here, just to make sure we stay on topic a little more if we have to. We don't really have to, right, Chris? Is that the concept there, the fundamental concept, as I understand what Jefferson was saying, is this idea of not having generational tyranny. It has to be adaptable to what the current generation is. And there's an almost 4-year gap in age between my wife and I, who's older. And the nature of where that falls for us, we run into this all the time, the technology we're using here. We're just in that period of when computers were becoming the norm, such that there's that 4 years makes a difference in a personal computer thing that, because of what she does, has rippled out over multiple decades, to the extent that even though she lives, in a laptop computer world with Zoom capabilities like this, it's that 4 years mattered because of what she was exposed to. So there, that's nowhere close to 19 or what eventually you draw it out to, because you're looking at what the life expectancy is in order to be able to do this. But it really wasn't until this conversation that it suddenly occurred to me, if a Jefferson were alive today, would he be arguing for 19 years? Would be arguing for 19 months? In terms of, and there comes some point where it has to just be reasonable, because you can't be constantly doing it. Right. And so it's, even thinking about the other thing that popped into my head, and I'll shut up here because I want to hear everybody else's thoughts. The idea of once every 10 years taking the census, that's an adequate sampling and an adequate frequency in order to be able to deal with the population growth, expansion, shifts that are happening, and apportioning your representatives. We see very radical shifts now in population growth and relocation. The decade probably is still about right now, but it's barely, I would argue, right now compared to in 1787. First of all, we can hardly do this. So doing it once every 10 years is going to be an incredible exercise. We don't have the technology to do it anymore more frequently than this, but 10 years will be more than adequate. I think the argument can be made now, borderline to whether 10 years is an adequate representation or not.
Yeah. I'll throw one more thing into the mix, which Don, you are, and you and Chris are dancing around a little bit, but Jefferson, what constitutes a generation for him, right? So at the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of people around the world who write constitutions tend to be 55 and older, right? And so does the current generation is arguably Generation Z. Do they get to write it? And what that constitution would look very different than a constitution that I would write at 56. So there are lots of ways that you can think about generational constitutions. In 1825, they wouldn't have thought it this way. They still would have been old white men who were writing it. But you got to think of a generational constitution in multiple dimensions, not just singularly.
And I have another interesting thought, which is we've talked about moving it around, but I have a real practical concern about that, in that it becomes almost like a prime minister dissolving their government and calling a new election. And you do it specifically so that you get the outcome you want, because a constitution drawn in 1943 is very different than the constitution drawn in 1953, or if it's drawn in 1963, that's a very different constitution.
Right. And my fear is always, and I think Jefferson understood this, the reality is that you probably need constitutional reform, constitutional overhaul frequently, right? So let's take Don's every decade. Absolutely. There's no question a constitution as fundamental law loses its credibility if it's overhauled too many times. The average life expectancy around the world of a constitution is 19 years, just as Jefferson said. But a lot of the constitutions that are changing over every 15 to 19 years are seen as jokes. So you got to balance the credibility and legitimacy. This Madisonian idea of an enduring constitution needs to have the respect and cachet with the Jeffersonian idea that constitutional change accelerates, as Don points out.
I think I have the perfect solution.
There you go. Been waiting for it, Eric. Thank you.
It is my right as a Californian to interject. Basically, in honor of the greatest Enlightenment thinker, Thomas Hobbes, we should pick one person, some kind of Leviathan-like entity, and when they pass away, we create a new constitution. Since this is a former British colony, we should do this on the monarchy. And so basically, Charles III should be in charge of writing our new constitution.
That sounds good to me. And, I've always said that life is nasty, brutish, and short anyway. So.
Because the constitution drawn up by the first Charles would have worked out so well.
Yeah.
I mean, it worked out for Ollie Cromwell. That's a great for Ireland.
The other thing that struck me, I think this actually ties back to we'll intersperse some things that for us, the time is compressed here because we just finished recording the room where it happened that hopefully our listeners had listened to, is you talked about the founders drew upon the documents and the history that they had. And the thing that just struck me, we're talking about, when would you amend or when would you change? Actually, the thing that popped into my head is the Old Testament concept of the year of Jubilee, in the sense that was a fixed period of time. And so, the concept of the way that the economics what was designed inside of that for Israel as a nation, you see there is the fact that, slaves are made free, land reverts back. This idea that there's the great reset, essentially every 70 years is the concept. And I think if we did have this idea of we know when the next one's going to be, back to something that we talked about there, would you defer or wait on some things? And with the issue that I was bringing up with the urgency of how technology is changing or other things are adapting, if that's too long, that creates a negative tension. If it's so imminent, you get into this stalemate of nothing's going to happen for the next 2 years because, need to see what's going to happen at the Constitutional Convention. It's due to be in Atlanta. They won the bid this time, so there we go. I think at some point, back to the question of would it be set? I think this was Robert's question or somebody's question. Would they have set the agenda or the timing for this? I think at some point, the very idea of what you're doing, that would be one of the big things at one of the conventions. How often are we now going to do this? So to Chris's point, it's not this arbitrary or abstract thing. We know when the next one's going to be, and that's now the rules. We know how that works.
Given this was the time of the Second Great Awakening, I think the Book of Jubilees especially would be very popular at this time. But everyone's like, yes, this is great.
But what I found interesting, Bo, is you took your conventions through, and I think this speaks to kind of what we're talking about, is the norms are pretty much observed from convention to convention.
Right. That's a good issue, Robert.
That they kind of pick the norms up, and they don't even break the secrecy one until like the 1903 one.
1903,
yeah, is when they start breaking that one. But until then, it was really, they still met in Philadelphia or Boston in our one instance with the shades closed and no one knows what's going on. And they come together structurally. They come together and, okay, we have to have the committees that decide this and the committee that works on that. They pretty much followed the precedent set by the 1787 convention. And then I think even in this instance, in our fork for this convention, once again, living memory is still there.
Right. And I'll throw two more things into the mix. What happens if you have an Articles of Confederation? Right? What happens in 1825 if the framers of the 1825 Constitution produce such a clunker that there's an urgency, right? There's an Annapolis Convention, and the Madisons of the world have to step up and say, this is not working, when there's already a projected forward Constitutional Convention 38 years later. And then the second thing is, a fair number of state constitutions were either not adopted after they were written or not ratified by the people. So what happens if you have a constitutional convention in 1825 and it's not ratified by the people? Do you go back in 10 years later? What's the rule? So some of these things are just fascinating to think about. I do think in 1825, Robert, that the norms would have been pretty almost exactly similar. There really is a respect for the 1787 framers by 1825. But then things start to peel away over time in terms of the conventions of a constitutional convention. But there are these other pieces that make this a fascinating exercise in speculative history.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and with the hindsight, I think we definitely really should have had a reconvening of the Constitution in that year, because they're going to have, especially with Jackson, there will be so many constitutional crises, not just like, okay, so what happens if the vice president quits on the job so we have this national bank, is that constitutional?
Right. No, absolutely true.
Yeah. And I don't want to cut us off here, but I think that sort of where we are sets up well for the fact that we're coming back to this with another episode in the near term. And by the time we roll up to 1863, it's a little different than 1825 for a lot of reasons. a lot has happened in that period of time, and now we are almost, we're approaching more being almost a century removed from the original exercise. There's an institutional memory, but not a living persona memory that's there in quite the same way. And I think that's as we work through this, and I'm excited about doing this as we do it over the coming weeks and months and the time frame that we lay out to do this. This was the slam dunk. This was the easy one, right? To some degree, Bo. I think when you wrote it, this was, it was obvious what needed to be fixed. The two big things that were going to be there, whether you believe the 1825 changes forestalls or hastens the Civil War, so that you're not in the middle of the Civil War by the time you get to 1863, we will assume that we are. But it's a different exercise when we come back and revisit this again, even in this short period of time historically that happens between 1825 and 1863.
Yes, probably more, Don, there's probably more dramatic change that leads to sort of constitutional crises and issues between 1825 and 1863 than any other time in my speculative historical evolution.
I would agree. Anybody have any last closing thoughts? That burning question that if we don't get a chance to get it out here, I will get not a nasty email, but I'll get reminded the next time we gather together that we skipped over it. All right. Bo, we've enjoyed having you. We're looking forward to having you back. And I'll close out, as we do a lot of episodes here, by inviting our listeners to visit our rudimentary little place on the web, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. It's a chance for you to give feedback on this episode. We don't get a lot of our listeners who go there and give feedback. It's the nature of the podcast medium. You're listening probably in your car, and you may have every intention to respond back, but you're not going to easily do that. But I really do encourage our listeners to respond back to this and let us know what you thought. And go and get Bo's book, read Bo's book. And this is one of those great opportunities to seed the conversation and the questions that we have for subsequent episodes. You know where we're going here, more so than we even normally do on the podcast. We're going to these subsequent conventions. So we'd love to hear from you so that we're crowdsourcing more of the concept of what's going on here. I said crowdsourcing, which leads me to immediately recommend and talk about what's going to happen on September the 22nd, which is the first A Fork in Time, the Room Where It Happened live stream. We're gonna take the risk. Chris, you asked yesterday because I posted something in our Slack channel. We do have some things that have come in from our listeners that I know we're going to be talking about. I had promised that I would not share those so they were fresh to you, but I can guarantee you that they have ramifications of things that may lead to fighting words before it's all said and done. So if that brings our
are you people out there talking about barbecue again with us? Because
I refuse to answer that under the fact that I have Fifth Amendment rights under what was attached to that 1787 Constitution. But yes, it may involve food. I will just go there.
And it be there in 1825, Don. We just did an episode about this possibly.
Well, there you go. All right. Hey guys, I really do appreciate that. I knew this was going to be fun. This exceeded what I thought it was going to be in terms of fun. So I'm excited to come back to it. We invite our listeners to go and visit the website, to give us that feedback, give us your topical suggestions. That's how Bo found us, for us to find him, for us to be here. This is how the majority of the people that I see on the screen here, is that true? No, some of these people I knew before this, but a large number of the people that are part of this now as a result of this process. As Alexis and I have said all along, one of the things we've enjoyed about this most is a community that we're building. We're not retiring on this. I'm not getting to quit my job early as a result of this, but I keep coming back and doing it because it's just fun to do. So we encourage you, our listeners, to go and visit those things. If you do like what we do and you want to throw a little support our way to help offset the cost, we do have our Patreon link there, a chance for you to contribute to the show financially. But if you don't contribute financially, mention the show to somebody. I had the opportunity yesterday at a work event to end up in a conversation with somebody, and we ended up talking about the podcast for 30 minutes. And it wasn't because I wanted to talk about the podcast for 30 minutes. They wanted to ask me questions about the podcast once they came to know. So if you haven't mentioned it to somebody you think might be of interest, mention it to them. Social media. Use social media for good and not just for evil. Mention the podcast. There are all the ways that you can do it. For Alexis, for Chris, for Robert, for Eric, especially for you, Bo. And I know Bo stayed up late, by the way. He's over in the United Kingdom right now, teaching this semester. So he burned the midnight oil on 9/11, which is the day where it's not 9/11 where he is anymore. It's now 9/12 where he is.
Sure.
And so we appreciate him doing that to accommodate everybody's schedule. And she gets to do this because the genetic thing gives her the right to do it. Alexis, what do we suggest that our listeners do if they happen upon that fork in time?
Take it.
Take it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.